Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising. As we explore the agony of war, the aftershocks of war, and what it means to be a veteran of war. You know, if you watch the news, particularly around Ukraine, although if you remember back around Iraq and Afghanistan, there's always the beginning of war around celebration, triumphalism, a sense that we are defending civilization. And as the young men and women march off to war, there are parades and celebrations and a euphoria that we are fighting for truth and justice and the American way. And then the meat grinder of war takes young lives, not even having reached their prime, just emerging into adulthood, full of idealism, and turns them into either corpses or traumatized beings, and then spits them out the other side. But that hardly ever gets in the news. And if you just think about what we're witnessing day by day around Ukraine, it's all around the celebration of war and the fierce determination to gain victory. And the hundreds of thousands of casualties are never even mentioned. And yet, they constitute the enduring legacy of war. So today we want to dialogue with a veteran of war and talk about his story and talk about what it means and some of the challenges that veterans of all countries, everywhere in the world, face through the agonies of post-traumatic stress disorder and a range of afflictions that enter their psyche and their soul and their bodies. War is hell. And it's when we forget that we go to war. And then the veterans remind us of what we have forgotten. Before we dive into that very deep and complex domain, let us just simply pause, as we always do on Humanity Rising, and let us just breathe together. We're going to take 10 breaths together, and then we'll begin our program. Thank you, everyone, and welcome to Humanity Rising. Thank you, everyone. It's so good to breathe with you and to consciously intend coherence. It's what we need in our world today, particularly as we look war in the eye by examining the aftershocks and the legacy of war. And to do that with us today, I am very privileged actually to invite an old friend of mine, Larry Winters, who I first met a number of years ago, I guess about a dozen years ago, who was a doctoral student at Ubiquity University. He came in through our dean of our wisdom school, Dr. Will Tagle. He did a splendid dissertation on what it was like to be a vet, and I read his book, The Making and Unmaking of a Marine, which was based on his experience in the Vietnam War and how it shattered his life, and how through one series of miracles after another, he reconstituted who he was and what he needed to do in the world. So as we've been contemplating various aspects of the war in Ukraine, but I also want to bring in the war in Sudan, the war in Yemen, wars in East Asia, the Middle East. War is the same everywhere. And so we're going to just talk with a single vet today as a microcosm of a global problem and challenge. So Larry Winters, please turn on your video and enter the conversation. There we go. Larry Winters, everyone. And I want to welcome you, Larry, and thought we would just begin with you telling your story of being a young man and how you entered the Marines and what happened to you in Vietnam, and a little bit about the aftermath. And I might just say, everyone, one of the ways that Larry healed was through poetry. So he's going to also be sharing some of his poetry with us today. So we want everybody to just breathe together with an open heart for this dialogue. So thank you, Larry. Tell us your story.
Thank you, Jim. Just listening to what you said about the current wars going on, I recently stopped listening to the news because I couldn't take the stimulation from it, mostly about all the wars we're in. So you brought that back to mind, and I appreciate it, because I'm going to talk about that now. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York called New Paltz. The Vietnam War was well on the way. It was in 1967. I was in history class, and my history teacher, Dr. Fiore, was giving a class. He had a world map pulled down, and he had a pointer, and he snapped that pointer really hard against the map, which sounded like a gun going off. And he looked at all the young men in that history class, and he told us that we would be young men that would be going to this place. I didn't even know where it was on the map. I never knew what Vietnam was. I was completely ignorant of what was going on in the war and in the politics. And that was the first time I heard the place, Vietnam. And from there, what was going on in my home was that I was not getting along with my dad, who was I felt like I was a hired hand to my father, who bought an old dilapidated house. Over the years of my childhood, I helped renovate the house with him. We grew our own food. We lived away from everybody. It was in sort of I did have one neighbor on the 3-mile road. And at some point, I just began to rebel against his authority. And it turned out that I thought, as I became a senior, that maybe one of the ways to become a man would be to join the Marines and go to war, because I had no idea what that meant, really. But I thought it would be instant man. You know, I just go to boot camp, come back, and my father will stop behaving the way he had.
Wow.
And I'm going to skip ahead because I became, at some point, you'll hear about this further on in the story, you'll understand that I became a psychotherapist that was the head of veterans treatment. This was probably 8 years ago. I was doing this at the hospital I worked at. And I saw so many young men that came in from 9/11 for the same reason I joined: instantly become a man. Get the label of a Marine or a person that had gone through boot camp and became a soldier or a naval officer or whatever. And this is still going on, I think, for young men. It's an initiation. We don't have appropriate initiations for men into true manhood. I spent the rest of my life trying to become a man, figuring out what the hell it was to actually be a real man. It wasn't a Marine. A man was not a Marine. A Marine is a soldier. There's a difference. In boot camp, which it was the first time I had an experience with being pushed way beyond my father, pushed to the point where I was physically exhausted and frightened, and then having messages pounded into me about who I was going to kill and why I needed to kill this enemy, and who we sang songs about the enemy. We had a continuous we were bombarded with shit from the enemy to hate the enemy. I learned later on when I read Sam Keane, who wrote Faces of the Enemy,
Yes,
that we do this to the entire society. We do it really strong in boot camp, but the entire society is looking at posters and propaganda that these human beings we're going to kill aren't really human beings. They're monsters.
yes.
They rape our women. They do all of these posters. If you look at Sam Keane's book, you'll see he does a great job with that. So I go from boot camp. Eventually, I wind up being shipped to Vietnam. And I go over with my entire squadron. I'm working in helicopters, and my entire squadron went, which is very unusual because they attempted to send men to Vietnam individually, which was there's a real psychology behind doing that. You don't have these unities and friendships and things that were made where people were communicating with each other that worked in a squadron. You just separate everybody and send them off individually. So they enter not only a war, but they enter platoons and other groups that are fighting that they don't know, that they have no relationship with, that they don't know whether they can trust them or not. This was a strategy to keep all the protest that was going on in the States from bleeding into the population on the ground in Vietnam.
Isolation, that's such a classic technique. Isolate people. Yeah, it weakens them.
Yep. So my whole squadron went, which was a little bit different. So I went with my friends. And in Vietnam, I became aware slowly what I was being asked to do, because we remained friends, and there was enough input into the fact that I began to feel like, what the hell are we doing here? Why am I doing this? And so that leaked in a little bit. I want to go back to boot camp before I forget it. because in boot camp, when I realized I was being brainwashed, there was a fragment of morality left in me that I made a commitment in boot camp that someday I will write about this. Someday I will talk about what they're doing to me. And that voice has never left. It's the only thing, it's the seed that I kept through all that I'm going to tell you.
Well, let's just pause there for a minute, Larry. This fragment of morality, that's an extraordinary turn of phrase. Say a little bit more about it. What was it, a sense that there's something wrong with this picture? Was it like the do unto others as you would have them do unto you? What say a little more about this fragment of morality?
Yeah, I realized I didn't completely buy that I had to kill another human being.
Gotcha.
That
violated something in you, something very deep in you.
Right. And I thought I could feel being pushed to the very edge of accepting that. And I didn't quite take the next step. I was close. I was very close. And, they say things like, if you're not willing to follow orders, then somebody is going to die. If it's not you, somebody that you are responsible for will die. So the cohesion that is created among Marines is to keep them alive. So if one man dies, he may have saved 10 men. And so there's a very powerful and strong psychology that is being used. Mm-hmm. And I got fractured for sure, but there was a small piece left. And that's why I'm here today, why I'm talking to you, why I've written poems, why I've written a play, why I wrote 2 books, why I am still alive, why I feel like, there's a possibility of being able to help others. And I'll get to helping others and how that was part of my healing process.
By the way, I just want to dwell on that just for one more moment, Larry, because it's such a powerful point of this fragment of morality. And I remember Danny Sheehan, who we just had on Humanity Rising, had a similar experience with his fragment of morality. He joined the Green Berets, and because he thought that was a good idea. And like you, not knowing anything about anything, just, I'll just join the Green Berets and I'll show them how tough I am. And one of the things they did was to give each one of the Green Berets a puppy. And they were told to care for the puppy and feed it and, everything. And then at that point, they were told to kill the puppy. And most of them did it. And Danny realized, this is his fragment of morality. He realized he couldn't do that. And he quit. And so that's a very important point that you're making about, and all of us have a fragment of morality. And when we're being pushed to a limit, there's always something in us to say, wait a minute. And how we interact with that fragment can determine our destiny, and whether we're deepened or we're made more fractured, determining how we compromise or not with that inner voice that is always there and always tells the truth. Yeah. But anyway, keep going with your story. But that fragment of morality is a beautiful, beautiful, profound point.
Taking the oath. There's an oath that every soldier must take and every Marine must take. And that oath ends in, "So help me God." And I've come to believe that religion has caused more wars in humanity than any politics or rhetoric. And so they use religion the military uses religion to have people offer their lives. And this, I don't know what to do with this, but I have a poem I'm going to read about this. And I think I'll do it right now because I struggled with this. I didn't find God on the battlefield. I didn't find God in Vietnam. I didn't see God when I came home. And I had been brought up, a Methodist. I wasn't a strictly religious person by any means, but I'd been told enough as a Boy Scout and as I went to Sunday school and I went out the back and bought candy with the money I was given for the offerings. So I wasn't that religious, but okay, this is a poem I wrote called Your Heaven is Just a Game. For 18 years, I kneeled by my bed. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. Should I die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Well, I went to Sunday school, said the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, followed the golden rule, showed up for Boy Scouts, was told over and over, thou shalt not kill. Prayed, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. At 18, in boot camp, learned how to forget from where I came, how to shoot and laugh, how to kill without blame. For 18 years, I raised my hand to my heart in Boy Scouts, my 3 fingers to my brow, with Moses' words still in my head, I prayed to God to quiet my fears. Then Uncle Sam sent me to use my skills. So I did what he said. I shot my gun to kill. Then I realized someone was dead. Since I came home from a war, I couldn't get the battle out of my head. I'd be half a man if I didn't slay. I tried to walk away from death, but found I'm half a man anyway. When I came home, you wouldn't look at me, but pinned hero ribbons on my chest. Now I roam this land, a man in a race, trying to find my own burying place. Because of war, I'll never kneel again. I'll never go through your church doors. The golden rule is for the fool. I hollered your name, no one came. The kingdom has come, my will was done. On earth there is a war, and your heaven is just a game.
Beautiful, beautiful. Your heaven is just a game. Continue with your story. Tell us, I imagine as a helicopter gunner or whatever you were, you saw a lot of action in Vietnam, because the helicopter back in that time was sort of a frontline military position, if I remember correctly. So tell us a little bit more about your actual experience, and then carry on with what happened when you went home.
Well, in Vietnam, I was in CH-53s, which are cargo helicopters. So we delivered troops. It was a big enough helicopter to lift a bulldozer. It was a big enough helicopter to carry 30 men onto a mountaintop. So we delivered supplies and men to LZs all over Vietnam at the mountaintops. So we were flying over the jungle all the time. And there is one saying that I remember in Vietnam, kill anything that moves. There was a book written about it. I can't remember the guy's name, but the book was incredibly powerful because it talked about why that phrase became universal to every man in Vietnam knew that phrase.
Wow.
And it had to do with, for me, if you killed anything, you put a conical hat, like a gunslinger puts a notch in the handle of his gun. You put a conical hat on the helicopter. You painted it on the helicopter. But this saying, kill anything that moves, came from to support McNamara, who wanted to deliver to the public that we were winning the war. So he got numbers every day that he then gave to the news media to tell the American public that we were winning that war. We weren't just losing people and paying huge amounts of money. We were winning the war. And so that was, there's all kinds of, well, I could go on more about it, but that's important to know. So yes, I flew in a helicopter, and there were other incidents that I had. I don't want to go into the actual gory war details, but I had enough exposure to having to do what I was told to do, that I still carry it, and I still have deep feelings about it. I got back home from Vietnam and immediately tried to act like I was returning to a normal life. So I got married. But I invited 2 fellow Marines that were in Vietnam with me to live in my house with my new wife and me, which
sounds like a good idea.
When I look back at it, I can't believe that she allowed me to do that, but there was nobody to talk to. There was nobody I knew. I went to college. I went to a community college. I was a freshman in a community college after 4 years in the Marine Corps and coming back from Vietnam. And the kids were still throwing spitballs. And I just couldn't handle it. There was nobody, there was one other veteran in the whole college that I was able to talk to. And so I had these men come and live with me, and they were there for almost a year. And we just together worked at trying to piece together what happened to us and what was this whirlwind of insanity that we were just part of. And I think in some ways it did help, but I don't think it helped my marriage much. And then I had a child, and my main focus, and I had a son, and my focus was to never let him go to war. So before he could probably understand what I was writing poetry to him about the war that I would give to him later on, so he would know what war is. And I just put gruesome, terrible things into this poetry, thinking that someday I will deliver it to him, and I will never let him go to war. And that also didn't really work well, because I was still so preoccupied with trying to get my feet back on the ground. And
did you join the anti-war movement at that point, or were you just preoccupied with your own inner journey?
That's a good question. I did not join. I aligned with, but I would join nothing. I would never join any, and I still won't join anything. Joining any group that does anything is difficult for me after the Marine Corps. But yes, I supported Vietnam veterans against the war. I supported, I began to try to put my mind together. It took me 15 years before because I'm going to be talking in a minute about going back to Vietnam. I went back to Vietnam in 1994 to study PTSD in the Vietnamese people with healthcare professionals from New Haven, VA, which is connected to Yale. And I went there and we studied PTSD in the Vietnamese people. That's what happened. And by the time I finally started to get my game back together, and I became a psychotherapist working at a psych hospital. But and we'll just go to that point because that was critical for me, returning to Vietnam. The man that owned the hospital was Sam Klagsburn, who was a Holocaust survivor, who walked across Europe from Belgium with diamonds sewn in the seams of their clothes. You know, and you've heard this. This actually happened in his life. And he became a psychiatrist and started the hospital. And he hired me at some point. And I went into his office and I said, Sam, there's an opportunity to go back to Vietnam and study PTSD. And I was wondering if the hospital will send me. Can you afford to send me there to study this? He says, no, we can't do that. Then he pulled out his checkbook.
Mm.
And he wrote me a personal check from his own checking account. And that was a monstrous step in my healing. That somebody did that for me. Mm-hmm. And so he didn't give me the entire amount, but he gave me most of it. And he gave me incredible support to be able to do it. And so I went back to Vietnam. And when I was there, it was right around the time that they were neutralizing relations between us and Vietnam. And People to People was the organization that would exchange professionals with other countries, and People to People organized this. And we went there and visited with the dignitaries in Vietnam. So the people that were I met General Giap, who was the major general during the Vietnam War, and I spent time with him, and I spent time with another general, a general that had invited us. There were 6 veterans out of 30 people that went on this trip, and he invited just the veterans to go out for dinner. And we drove, 50 miles into the wilderness, ate at a restaurant that looked like a gas station, and started telling war stories with our, quote, once enemy. And this guy told a story about rowing out onto the Perfume River with Ho Chi Minh. And before they started to make battle plans for the next day, they read poetry to each other. And I had, well, that was just incredible to have that opportunity. And then later on, before we came home, they gathered a meeting with General Giap. So we came into this building, all of us, all 30 of us, to study, to talk about PTSD and what PTSD had done to them and what it had done to us. Mm. We went into psych hospitals. We looked at a 14 by 14 size room, had 25 people in it, wow, living in it. And so, but the reality of PTSD was not very apparent in the Vietnamese people. They didn't seem to be suffering it as much as we were, which was strange.
Interesting.
Yeah. So at the meeting with General,
how did you account for that? I mean, what would be your explanation for that difference?
Well, I think it's complicated, but part of it is that they won the war. Mm-hmm. And part of it was they were honored and they were respected and they were taken care of. If you fought in that war, you were taken care of. But there were a lot of Arvin and there were a lot of people that supported Americans that went into concentration camps. So it's not a simple thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that meeting, I had written a poem to read in that meeting, and I had it translated by our Vietnamese interpreter. And during that meeting, there were these two elderly men that were scientists that got up with bulletin boards and slides, and they showed babies in bottles at the museum that had suffered from Agent Orange. They went on and on and on about how much death Agent Orange had created in Vietnam. And we had nothing to do with Agent Orange. None of us knew anything about Agent Orange. But they just inundated us for an hour and a half with information about how devastating it was. And I stood up at some point and asked a question to try to change the topic. I said, what do you do with your hatred towards us because of this? And they said, oh, one guy stands up, he says, I don't hate you. We let bygones be bygones. Which nobody believed, but that's what he said. And the man that stood up later on stood back up and he pointed at me because I'd asked him. And he said, I hate Americans because my wife died of Agent Orange. And from there, I'm going to read the poem that I read.
Oh, please do.
To the Vietnamese. And there was television cameras there and all kinds of people there. And the most important people showed up at this thing because it was people to people. Viet Cong, the spirit I have taken from your heart, from your country, from your land, from your people, from your beauty, from your soul, from your fathers, from your mothers, from your children. I return to you. I am one man. I have lived with sadness, holding your spirit prisoner in my heart. Forgive me. And after I finished that poem, those two old men that were talking to us for 2 hours rushed up to me like little boys and begged me for the printed poem. That was another serious step forward for me.
You know, your mention of Agent Orange reminds me of an experience that I had with my cousin. I was active. I was one of those who refused the draft, and I was very active in opposition. And I think it was in 1967, 68. I can't remember now. We were at a July 4th party, and my father very sternly told me before going, it was a gathering of all our relatives, not to mention anything about the war. But being young and bolshy, I couldn't help myself. But my cousin, a kid named Daryl, my age, stood up and said that he was completely in support of the war, and he was going, and shame on me, and my father was embarrassed, and and I said, just defiantly, but I said, well, let's just wait till you come back. If you come back. And that was obviously inappropriate and so forth because it challenged his patriotism and so forth. But to make a long story very short, when he came back, Larry, he was one of the guys that had been dumping the Agent Orange. And his whole body and emotions were completely destroyed. He came back in a wheelchair. And he was just completely, he had epilepsy, he couldn't kind of move. He was essentially a wasted human being. What added insult to injury was that the government refused to accept any responsibility. As you know, for decades, the government refused to acknowledge that Agent Orange didn't do anything to anybody and refused to extend any kind of special aid to the vets. And this little young man wasted away and finally just died. But the Agent Orange was real. That was a real poison. And it was dumped by the thousands of tons all over Vietnam. So, that can just imagine the little babies in bottles and all the other stuff that just happened. Again, shoot anything that moves. That's what led to the My Lai massacre. I'm sure it was that mentality, which had been encouraged by the government. And then when people actually did it, in the case of My Lai, but even then, there was very little and very tardy response. So, wow, what a story. And did you sustain the relationships with the people that you met in Vietnam?
McNamara, when I got home, McNamara had just written his book. Basically, I can't remember the title of it, but it was his swan song to all that he did. And I bought 5 copies of the book, and I sent it back to these guys I met in Vietnam, the professors and the different people that I met there, and they were extremely happy to get this book. I never followed through any more than that, and I haven't kept in touch with them. It was too difficult to try. The computer business was not quite as advanced as it is now, where I could be talking.
That was pre-internet,
right? Yeah. Let me read a poem that has to do with Robert McNamara.
Oh, for sure.
Old men are bastards. The first line in Robert McNamara's book is, "This is a book I planned never to write." I wondered what he planned to do. Reminds me of my father's telling me 20 years later, he never really planned to beat the shit out of me. Old men are bastards. They act like bastards most of your life. And before they die, they tell you they're sorry. Abraham started it when he took his boy up the mountain, tied him up and held a knife over his head. Then he made up some crap about God and let the boy go. Robert McNamara took 58,000 men up the mountain, and 30 years later, he tries to let them go. Thanks, old man. This is a poem I planned never to write. But you wrote your book. I wish you had found a ram on that mountain, you old bastard.
Yeah, I wish he'd have found the ram. Absolutely, man. Absolutely. I remember meeting him. He came to a conference that I put on back before he died. And he was remorseful, I would say, but not truly sorry. And in the interactions that I had with him, he talked a lot about the fog of war.
Yeah.
Somehow, had he known more, and da 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 and da 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 da, he never quite confronted. He never found his ram. He never confronted the true brutality of what he did. And so that's a just poem. That's a just poem. Although as old men, Larry, in our 70s now, I hope we're not remembered as bastards.
Well,
there's some of us who find the ram.
Right. No, I realize that when I'm reading it, that I am one of those old men.
Yeah. Well, you found the ram because you engaged in the process of healing, and that's what I'd love to turn to. Tell us about, we started with the making and unmaking of a Marine, but tell us now about your real pathway to healing and how you went into the PTSD and came out the other side in a way that has enabled you to help thousands of vets and to be creatively active in the world. Tell us more about that.
Well, I think it started with the trip back to Vietnam and returning. When I got back, I had actually started to contemplate having a large gathering of both Vietnamese and Americans coming together here, bringing them over here, and actually having a conference that would look at the relationships that were beginning to happen because they had just started naturalizing relationships between each other. And I emotionally, I wasn't prepared to make that happen. I started it and I had 20 people gathering and we were starting to make a game plan for it. I was overwhelmed. I couldn't take it. Mm-hmm. So I had to back away from that. But I still have always thought that's part of what we've done. We've had a split, just even you and I. You were protesting and I was in the battlefield. And the fact that, we're talking about this and its truth is part of the healing that needs to occur, that didn't occur enough, that is seminally important. And because what grows out of it is what's going on today, I think. It's all been swept under a carpet that's never been taken out and cleaned. And all the behaviors that are going on in our society and the politics today has some roots in this business of that separation. That's what I believed. But what happened to me is I came back and eventually I have a good friend who you met once, Jim, Peter Pitsley, who was also a Harvard graduate. And Peter was working as a psychodramatist at a psych hospital. He invited me to join the hospital because I had done training in psychodrama with him. And when he got a job there, I went there and Sam hired me. And I began working with people who were really having a hard time. You can't get into a psych hospital unless you're either suicidal or you want to hurt somebody. And because of managed care and because of the way that insurance companies pay, you get the people that really can't afford to be anywhere else, or so this insurance must pay for you to come. So I dealt with endless amount of suicidal feelings in patients.
Wow.
And
the suicide rates of the vets are astronomical.
They are unbelievable. So what I learned in working endlessly, doing 3 groups a day with 14 people in a group, is I learned about suicide, and I learned that I had learned something about death in Vietnam because I never thought I was coming home. So I spent every day anticipating that that's my last day. I am not going to make it.
Wow.
And so I used that to confront and look at people who told me they wanted to kill themselves right in their face and connect with them and not be frightened away from sitting with them trying to understand what drives suicide. One of the things that I came up with is rage. Rage is one of the emotions that gets bottled up and directed at self. So very often these suicides that occur are absolute rage turned as into self-murder. And as a result, if you don't understand that or look at it that way, then you don't have any access to what else could we do with that rage? How could we direct that some other way? Or who are you aiming it at that you're not saying anything about, that you just want to make them pay because they find you after the suicide? So who finds you is often a big piece of the puzzle. I don't want to go too far into this, but I have spent a lot of time in that realm. And it allowed me to deal with this population in a different way than a person that hadn't been through what I was through, to do it as comfortably and as easily as I did it. It's not comfortable or easy, but I was able to manage it. And so I became very good at that. And I made a good living, and I became honored and appreciated. And then I became head of veterans treatment for that hospital. And we were dealing with clients that were coming from West Point before they'd even gone to war. And so I had a lot of opportunities to be able to manifest that. Just before I retired from that, I got involved in an organization called Intersections International, which was on Fifth Avenue down in New York City. And what they were doing is that they had a good deal of funding and a beautiful building that they were using and creating programs that were international. And I started a program called Veteran Civilian Dialogue, because I feel like that's where the problem is between veterans and civilians. There is no true dialogue. There is no deep dialogue. And so we spent a lot of time facilitating. I wrote a manual on how to create a program of supporting veteran civilian dialogue. And that ran for 3 years. We had probably about 110 people show up every other week or so for 3 years.
Wow.
And the Pentagon invited us to come because no one has focused on civilians. They thought that was unique. I do too. I think most of these programs are all about helping veterans. And as soon as you try to help a veteran, then you're identifying that there's something wrong with them. And that's not what it's about. It's more difficult for civilians to understand how to talk about their own wars. And from what I know, having worked with civilians for 25 years that were suicidal, that there are wars in many households. There are wars in the streets. There are wars all over the place that have equal amount of fear and trauma that are connected to them. So there's plenty of information in the civilian world that can be related to what the veterans are going through.
You don't have to go to war to experience trauma.
Right.
Right. Absolutely.
So that was part. Yeah.
I'd like to go back just for a moment, Larry, to your exploration and awareness around suicide and rage. And I'd like to just probe that. Amy Blumenschein has made a very interesting comment. She says, I think that rage is partly over the scream of the soul defiled. And then Catherine Augustine is asking, do you believe that behind the rage is brokenheartedness and deep sorrow and agony? Would love to have you, just since you were so deeply immersed and saw so many people in that very specific nexus of suicide, say more about what you learned about the origins of rage and why that rage then, rather than projected outward, that's what I did. I was so outraged, I projected it outward, and I was organizing and storming the Bastille and all of that. But when suicide happens, that rage gets internalized. To go into that process more deeply.
Well, I would agree with both of the statements that were made by Amy and this other person.
Yeah, Catherine.
That it's complicated because very often the person that has made a suicide attempt has an individual outside them that has either hurt them or is their action is aimed at. So this is important. That
I'm going to kill myself to punish you in some way.
Right. I'm going to leave you. I'll choose the place. I'll choose the way. You'll have to deal with it. So that is part of it. Mm-hmm. But at the deeper levels, at the soul level, I think that it's absolutely, that's what you wind up doing, self-murder. You kill yourself. And if it's either a self or a soul that is taken. And I think for me, it had more to do with the environment that person was living in than it did. They didn't have the spiritual context that Amy has, most of them, most of the people I was dealing with. If you've got a spiritual context, then there's other ways we could talk about it. But if you're simply surviving in an environment or a relationship that is so difficult to manage, very often that's the place you begin. And of course, I had 14 people in a group that lasted for an hour, and I attempted to work with all of them. Wow. So I didn't have a lot of time to dig, but there is digging to be done for a person who then, if there was such a thing as talk therapy, that really worked. But I could go on and on about what's going on in mental health because it is all driven by medicine and insurance companies.
Oh, yeah. Well, let's talk about that for a moment because that is at the heart of, I would say, the dysfunction of the vet administration and healing generally in the Western world is this interface between big pharma and insurance. And even like, as you said, the people that end up in the hospitals are there at a critical point where there's no other option because the insurance companies won't cover anything else.
Right. So
talk a little bit about that.
I'll give you two examples and make me come back to this one. I want to talk about the VA, but I'm going to first start with the hospital.
Sure.
So in the hospital, you, depending on your insurance policy, you have to be suicidal to come even at all to the hospital. So that leaves treaters and individuals with the policies having to say that they want to take their lives in order to get in. And everybody knows this now. So you've got people that may not want to take their lives, but they're telling you they're going to take their lives in order to get in. And then once you get in, if you don't take the meds that you're being prescribed, and often the meds are going through the insurance company's doctor, not the one that's looking at you. There's limitations on, that person is going to have influence on what meds you take. So very often a person will come in and the diagnosis of bipolar illness is one that gets used over and over again because the stay is longer. So the treater, the doctor, is stuck. He sees that 2 days ago, this person tried to take their life. He's going to put them on meds. He's got to, if he wants to keep them in the hospital long enough that we can even figure out why they wanted to do it, he'll have to put them on psych meds that maybe they don't belong on, is to keep them there. And this was going on so much when I was there, and I'm pretty sure it hasn't changed. So you've got this dilemma, this moral dilemma in the treaters who have no options because it's a business. And I'm going to go to the VA now because I sleep with a CPAP, which I get from the VA. Sleep apnea.
What's a CPAP?
A CPAP is a machine that I put on my face at night that helps me breathe. And if I need, it's an important, because my breathing shuts down when I'm sleeping. So it's a critical tool.
It's like a sleep apnea.
Yeah, I have sleep apnea, and the CPAP is the treatment for it.
Gotcha.
So 2 years ago, Philips, who makes CPAPs that the VA buys, found out that the insulation, the soundproofing in the CPAP causes cancer. So Philips sends me a letter, stop using the CPAP. It will cause cancer. Okay, so I call the VA. This is all took God knows how much time and back and forth. I'm just condensing it to a few minutes. I get the response from the VA saying, we want you to use the CPAP because you're more likely to stay alive if you're using the CPAP than if you get cancer. That went on for almost 2 years. They did not get another CPAP manufacturer to fix it. They just left it go on and on and on. It took me 2 years to get a new CPAP. And I've written in the newspaper and I've written to the VA and it's been ignored. It's never hit the public. No politician wants to talk about it. It is unbelievable. And there's that kind of thing. And I think that they're overwhelmed at the VA and they're understaffed. And it's really not the people at the VA that work there, the people that are on the front line with dealing with patients. It's the administration and it's the politicians that are ignoring this. And now Biden is cutting back on the money for veterans. It's going on right now. It's one of the negotiating items.
Yeah. Along with cutting aid to poor people and social welfare. And yeah, absolutely. Now, someone was, Amy again, wondering about sleep apnea as quite common among vets. Do you know the research on that? Is that just one of the aspects of PTSD and post-war trauma?
What a statistic that I used and read about is that 80% of the veterans being treated by the VA that are Vietnam veterans are on CPAPs. So
say again, 80%?
80% of the Vietnam veterans treated by the VA are using a CPAP.
No kidding.
Yeah. So you have just that alone has segregated a huge group of people into that category, So who paid the most for the CPAP problem? Me.
And it's carcinogenic and they won't change it.
Yeah, there's younger veterans. I'm sure some of them wear CPAPs, but this is something that generally happens when you're older. And if you've gone through whatever these Vietnam veterans have.
Gotcha. Now, let me just ask you a couple other aspects of being a vet. You came through Vietnam, but you've obviously interacted with vets from, Afghanistan and Iraq, et cetera. And over your lifetime, Larry, are the effects of war the same no matter where you are? Have you noticed differences, generational differences? For example, Vietnam vets get sleep apnea, 80%, but in Iraq, are there different statistics that apply? Or is it basically war is the same? Do you have any sense on that?
I would I mean, it's a pretty broad thing that war is the same, but I kind of vote for that one myself. And the same includes many similar after effects. So the after effects of war are very, very similar in all wars. I mean, if you're using Agent Orange in one war and not in another, okay, there's a difference. But there's probably some other chemical we're using, or we're using drones, or what, we're in modern warfare now. And I think what we've done is that we've figured out how to kind of exclude many of the soldiers that are doing the killing have been reduced to drone operators and people that are running modern killing machines. And as a result of that, don't think that those guys or girls, women, aren't being affected by what they do when the flashes on the screens show up and that they go home and eat dinner with their family. I think it's profound, and that we're not paying any attention to what that does. And I've heard very little about looking at that reality. And the amount of money we spend on drones is phenomenal. It's in many billions of dollars is being spent on drones. And that it doesn't really, it's like bombing in Hiroshima, that bomb. The person that dropped it wasn't close, but the entire country was flying over Japan, every one of us. In fact, you're making me think of something I want to read.
Sure.
Who's accountable for the enemy's dead? Who's accountable for the enemy's dead? Is it the man peeling potatoes in the mess hall? Is it the clerk who typed the orders? Is it the recruit climbing the boot camp wall? The airman sweeping the hangar, the general pushing map pins in, the CB nail banger, the drill instructor on the rifle range, the guard that stands alone, the sailor making his bunk, the PFC on the battlefield picking through the bones. Did you forget what I said? Who's responsible for the enemy's dead? The recruiter at the school, the GI who's out getting drunk, the Humvee mechanic who's reaching for a tool, the grunt who pulls the trigger. Who is accountable for the enemy's dead? Is it the young couple who have paid their taxes, the housewife food shopping, the secretary sending faxes, the college kid who's out bar hopping, Wall Street's white-nosed money takers, the CEO whose heads rest on pillars of crank, the new card makers, the man at the race who fires a blank, the Congress and Senate whose children hold no rank. Let's not forget those vets who come home and start pumping H into their veins to kill the battlefield pains. And when they contract AIDS, it's you and me who wave at them in the parades and go home feeling good that we did what we should. They die alone, often without a home. Hold on a minute. Don't run away. This has taken me a long time to say. Stop holding your head. Take your hands from your ears. What you need to hear is that it's the soldier on the front and the soldier on the rear, the bomber in the sky, the protester who quits, whose questions why. It's you and me who is accountable for every single one of the enemy's dead.
Yeah, we're all Hitler's willing executioners. We're all in it one way or another, whether we're civilian or on the drone command or on the front lines. That's absolutely true. Thank you, Larry. And I'd like to now turn to kind of a final domain of inquiry with you. And that is, your experience in what of all the things that you've done with vets, what are the most effective pathways? And for example, let's take psychedelics, the use of MDMA, for example, with vets that's been shown to be powerfully illuminating. The vet civilian dialogues, the creative enterprise, like writing your poetry. Just feel in your voice and your being as you even read the poem years later that it's part of your healing process. Speak to us about healing the aftershocks of war among the vets and what you've learned and what are the effective techniques out there, because the vets keep coming.
Yeah. Well, I could include everyone in this, but listening is, in my opinion, the thing that heals people more than anything else. Active, real listening. And there are all kinds of modalities that I have experienced and used in the treatment of people. But when it comes down to it, it is actually paying attention fully to what somebody's saying and doing, and them recognizing that, being seen, being heard, being visible. And I'm writing something right now in the process of it. It has to do with the importance of attention. And I think we don't understand, or I don't fully understand, how important paying attention in the world is in relationship to what's going on around you. And it is a powerful dynamic that we need to begin to put into the equation of how we live our lives and how we interact with each other. Everyone wants attention. Animate, inanimate objects wants attention. Nothing exists unless it is seen in some way. And everything, living or non-living, needs to be seen, wants to be seen, is there to be seen. And so I believe that active listening, where you have to learn to shut up and not have your own dialogue in your head to say the next sentence, but just take in what's being said. If you're capable of doing that, even if you fake it, it sometimes works. But you need to know how to fake it. You got to pay attention, because we have, 40 muscles in our face that also communicate. And how we interact with people, and what they'll know, whether something's authentic or not. If somebody's listening or not. And I believe that is, in the end, the best that you can do. You can practice all of these modalities that are all used to teach people and used. I used to get a lot of medical students come in from Einstein and other hospitals to come in to my groups at the hospital when I worked there. And they're all smart kids that were really capable of, doing school well. And one of the things they're not learning at school is how to listen. How to actually listen to somebody. They know how to come up with answers, but they don't know how to listen. And I think that in the end, and at my age and where I am in my world, that's where I would bring all my focus into listening.
Yeah, it's remarkable, because when you're listened to, you feel seen and you feel healed, because that sense of being recognized is a profoundly healing therapeutic.
And that's what science, which is unbelievable. It's saved so many lives. It's a real thing. It's powerful. But the emotional world, you watch these politicians, almost all of their mistakes come out of some emotional place that they screw up. or they behave in such a way that, it's all connected to the inability to be able to listen or respond emotionally in authentic ways. And so, it's science has so much dominated. I mean, that's what my PhD dissertation was going to be about. If I would have finished it, it would have been about the importance of emotions. Instead of they get diminished in all these philosophies that everybody wants to put it away because it's not predictable. It's not, you can't get the same behavior twice, and all of this business. I think that's short-sighted.
Mm-hmm. And with your 3-year group, 100, 110 people that met for 3 years between the vets and the civilians, as it were, I imagine that was a process of deep listening and deep dialogue, because that divide between the vets and the people that don't go to war in every culture is very deep. What was the learning coming out of that?
The learning is that the vets were more capable of communicating than the civilians. And the vet was able to talk. If they were asked a difficult question, they usually had some form of response to it. But until, if you and I are having a deep conversation, if I say something that is deep, comes from deep within me, the likelihood that you'll return that with something deep from you, so we create an intimacy together, that is very difficult for the civilians who are in a role that they think that I can't ask him if he killed anybody. I can't ask him this. I don't want to upset him. He's been through more than I have. There's a whole configuration that they believe that isn't true.
Mm-hmm.
They're just as human. And like I said, the likelihood that the civilian might even gone through more than the veteran is a possibility. And
Sure.
so in order to deepen the conversation, we created exercises, we created ways to build trust. We created so there was cohesion. There's warm-ups that you can do that eventually slowly move into a deeper area where you can help people begin to reveal enough information. We kept politics completely out of it. No politics in the room. And because as soon as you got politics, you got rhetoric. You got things that other people are saying, not what you're saying.
Exactly.
And if that's not in the room, the conversation changes and it becomes much more universal.
Well, deep dialogue and deep listening has to be existentially personal, or if it's not authentic. So that's absolutely right. You keep the politics, you keep the ideologies and the rhetoric out of the room, because these are people. These are real people in a direct encounter of deep listening. That's so true. You think about Platonic dialogues of Socrates. He was an extraordinarily attentive listener, and that's why he could ask such penetrating questions of his friend or colleague in a way that caused them to realize they didn't know nearly as much as they thought they did. What about psychedelics? There's a lot of discussion about the utility of psychedelics now in not only vets, but just trauma generally. What's your sort of experience of that? What's your understanding or your evaluation of that?
I'm quite open to it. I have a good friend who's a physician who has led a number of people through an experience, and I've also looked at what happens at NYU. We're doing a lot of treatment for cancer patients and people coming to end of life crisis, and I've seen really positive outcomes to that. How you prepare to end your life. And that has expanded the possibilities of how people navigate that. I think that there's a lot of, I haven't been directly involved in any of these circumstances, or, you know, with anybody that was doing it at the time. But I think it could be quite valuable. I think it, you know, is something worth paying attention to. I don't know where the VA is with all of that, but I think it could certainly help open veterans up to communicating what is going on inside and
Sure.
finding new pathways on how to navigate it, because we can get very locked into the way that we want to interpret the world, and this can shatter and expand it or open possibilities, I'm pretty sure. But I'm not an authority on it, but I would absolutely be open to
No, and
support
another
it.
whole aspect is just taking vets or taking traumatized people generally into nature. There's a whole growing body of evidence, which is the obvious, right? You spend time in nature and nature heals, elevates your mood, and actually being in a forest, for example, just elevates the soul. In your work, have you used nature much? Although I suppose being in a hospital with suicidal patients, getting outside the hospital confines is probably quite a challenge, even if you wanted to.
No, I haven't worked with anybody that way. Although I have a friend who's been doing a fire pit, Peter Pitzley. He's running a fire pit, and I've gone to that several times. And there is a different environment to look at a fire and sit it with a group of people and return to nature, because it's it's absolutely in the woods. But I've also, with the Earth Tribe, which I was involved in with Will Tagle, I did a vision quest. And that vision quest was seminal to, I have always thought, but never been able to manifest, that vision quest for veterans that have gone deep into another world, and having come in a vision quest, you go into nature and you spend nights out, not eating, being in the wilderness, having some experience with nature, perhaps being frightened. And you come back and you're given a name that becomes, my name became Black Peace Eagle. I was given this name from what experience I had. And I got Black Peace Eagle because it's the black vulture. The vulture doesn't kill anything, but it eats off the battlefield. It eats dead. And that image and that mindset had a huge effect on the way I look at myself, my identity. I use it. It became a mythical way of using it to sort of put a compass inside of me. And I like that. I like mythology. I think mythology really, who's the guy that's doing all kinds of mythological work?
Joseph Campbell?
No.
Carl Jung?
A British guy. Oh God, I can't remember his name. Anyway, he's taking people on, not vision quest, but whatever they call it in England. He takes them out. He's an academic and guy that Martin. I lost it. I don't know, but I've been reading a book by him, and he's. I think mythology covers a lot of this stuff.
Sure, absolutely.
And that's a new territory for me, but I'm interested in it.
Yeah,
Martin Shaw.
Martin Shaw.
Yeah,
good. Well done, Larry.
Well, I'm reading. Tom put it on the screen.
Well, just as we close here, I want to read something that a member of the Earth Tribe, actually, Carol Flake, wrote in the chat, and then have you make whatever final comments that you would like to make to our global audience. She said, Larry, you have gone beyond the threshold as they say in the mythic tradition, and come back with a gift, the gift of healing. The wounded healer is the most gifted healer. And you're a wounded healer and a gift to us all. So I just want to acknowledge you, Larry, acknowledge your life, acknowledge your pathway, acknowledge your deep wisdom. And so as we close, I would just love to hear from you anything that you would like to say about the healing process or about trauma or about the authentic life in a traumatized world.
Well, thank you, Carol. I know Carol. She writes beautiful poetry. The way Intersections International invited me in to create the Veteran Civilian Dialogue was I came there and I read poetry. And at some point in that reading, I talked about the dynamic that was happening to me as I was reading poetry. It's also happened today. There are moments when I can feel tears come. I'm feeling it now. And that when that happens and it's recognized by the audience, there's a deep communication that's taking place that's not necessarily about the words. It's an affect. And that the audience is as important to me in paying some attention to what I'm saying, if they're paying attention. It really is as much for me as it is for you. I'm doing this as much for me as I try to do it. And if I'm doing it right, I'm also doing it for you. And I feel like that is where I start. I haven't got a lot of language for this attention idea, but I'm working on it. I'm writing something about it. And I'm using mythology. So I'm still sorting that out. And I'm willing to take any inputs. But I think that there's some way to evolve that into being something that could be taught.
Beautiful, beautiful. Larry Winters, everyone, a wounded healer, and therefore the most gifted of healers. Sorrow is a great catalyst for healing. And when one goes as deeply as you have, Larry, into that wound, the making and the unmaking of a Marine, what comes out is a beautiful soul. And so I just want to honor you and thank you for your life and your gift of healing to us all. It's been, I feel richly blessed today. This has been a beautiful, beautiful dialogue. So I thank you. And that'll bring us to a close, everyone. You're all welcome to the after session chat. Larry's going to join for those of you who want to extend this conversation. And then we'll see you all again tomorrow for our next session of Humanity Rising. But Larry, thank you. Thank you, brother.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.